Well, first of all, good morning. It's Friday, the 17th of January, 2025. That's the date on which I'm making this film. And the film, for me, I hope, is one that lasts very much into the future. I should start with a little something that we had when we sat down to listen to the radio back in the 1950s. It was called Listen with Mother, and it always began with the same phrase, and people of my age always remember it. Are you sitting comfortably? Good, then I'll begin. And that's what I'm going to do. If you're assuming that you're sitting comfortably, I want to talk to you about a period of my life which is merely a way into looking at some of the big changes that have taken place during the time that my family has been alive. It's a story which features, it's a Jewish story. It's a story about the upbringing of my father in the East End of London. He was born in 1915. He died in 1996. The story that I'm going to relate is partly a Jewish story. It's partly a Jack Perry story, and it's partly a China story as well, because those three elements come together and they are focused in the fact that gives me really my text for this presentation is to describe how my father came to be the first businessman to go to China in 1953. At the time, it was a significant event, but it's one that's grown in importance because of the importance of China. China, it was predicted, would play an increasingly large, more active role in international affairs. That was back in the early 50s. Today, 2025, the discussion is all about the coming confrontation between the incoming American President Trump and the emerging, powerful, economically strong and focused People's Republic of China. So that's where I'm going to get to. But I want to take some stepping stones along the way and explain to you how it was that a young Jewish boy from Hackney started life no differently from the circumstances of his contemporaries, managed somehow to become the first person the Chinese were prepared to put confidence in and invite him to China in the summer of 1953. So it's a Jewish story. It starts in the East End. It starts in Hackney. That's where my father was born in 1915. He met his wife in the 30s. She was born a year earlier in 1914. And one point I would mention here, because I don't want to lose sight of it, but Jack came from a very non-political family. His politics came, in the main, partly from the arrival of Hitler in 1933, a big turning point in his life, and partly from the emerging relationship that he had with his father-in-law. His father-in-law was a milliner. He worked in making caps. Every man in the East End of London, every person in England, they wore caps and hats, and millinery was a big business, and he was an employee of a company as a milliner. But he was an intelligent man, a well-read man, and a man with whom my father's emerging politics came into contact with in those months, years following the emergence of Hitler as the Chancellor of the Reich in Germany. So let me start by giving you a feel for where Jack was coming from, because his life was conventionally East End Jewish. His parents, his mother was from Russia, his father was from Poland. The father was a tailor, not a particularly successful tailor. He had more bad years than good years. They lived in Teesdale Street off Bethnal Green Road. The road was half Jewish. The other side of the road was Irish, and that's how it was in the East End of London. And the upbringing and the lifestyle and the day-to-day arrangements was conventionally Jewish. He came from a kosher home. He went to shul at least once a day. He was a bright student, so he often found himself leading the service. He worked hard at school. His mother was a very formidable lady, even though she was herself uneducated. She knew what she wanted for her children, and by all accounts, the father was rather compliant. And my father led a pretty traditional Jewish lifestyle. The home was kosher. If they went out, they went to Bloom's in Aldgate. They went to boxing clubs, Brady sports clubs. The popular entertainers of the time were Al Jolson was very, very popular. And in the 30s, Paul Robeson came on the scene. I mention him because he's a person that we met at a big funeral in 1960. So Paul Robeson was a significant figure for people in the East End of London because he was the spokesperson for the emerging black community in America. But the Jewish world of Hackney was shops, youth clubs, and synagogue. And Jack was one of the prize pupils within the synagogue. He was well regarded in the shul. He had a good voice. He was often called upon to lane at shul on a Saturday. He was often called upon to take the children's classes. And he was a schoolboy. He went to a Jewish school. There's one very funny story. I do like telling it because it's more a reflection of his mother than of him. But he went to school one day. His mother heard, he was about 7 or 8, his mother heard from friends that it wasn't a very good school. It was a Jewish school. She went to the school and found a reason to pull him out of the school. And as she's walking home, she walks past another school which looks attractive to her. She goes into the school, speaks to the head, and he accepts Jack as a pupil. So he switches schools from one to the other in the morning, not realizing that the school that she had chosen as the second school was in fact a Catholic school. And when that became apparent to her at lunchtime, she did what few other mothers would have done. She went back to that second school, took him out, found another Jewish school and put him into that school. Jack had 3 schools in one day. That was the kind of interventionist, assertive, enthusiastic mother that looked after him during his formative years. So shops, youth clubs, synagogue. This was the preparation for Jack. But there was one feature of his upbringing that really had a big significance on his whole life, and that was the issue of his health and asthma. So a big factor in my father's life, certainly in his early years, continued throughout his life, as I mentioned to you before, was the asthma problem, breathing problem. It was a big feature. He would suffer from asthma, and it would mean 3 weeks off school. And you know, in the 1920s, when he took 3 weeks off school, remember, there was no television, very little radio, no mobile phones, no laptop computers, very few comics, very small interaction with the outside world. It was a quieter existence than today. But his mother was not going to let him languish in bed. And this is an important part of his life. She was a strong lady. I'm going to give you a couple of stories about her involvement. I've already mentioned one with her intervention at school. There's a couple of others as well. But she knew that he had to be kept alert and educated. She didn't speak English very well. She didn't read English, but she knew one thing, one word, books. And she got a list of books that he needed to read. She would go to the library and come back home, put the books on the table and tell him, 3 weeks they're going back to the library, make sure you get them read. Now, I've always thought that this was an important aspect of my father's life, of his upbringing, because it meant at a very young age he developed a love of books, an appreciation of words, an understanding of the ideas and views and developments of life ahead of his contemporaries. It was a bad thing, the illness, that became a good thing. It gave him the opportunity to self-educate. And people often used to mention my father. I'm not just praising him to the skies, but how was it a man who was uneducated, who left school at 14, whose first job of work was as an assistant warehouse manager, was able to hold his own with prime ministers, leaders of industry, and with the leaders of China, as he did. When my father spoke, people listened. I don't want to pretend that he didn't have his faults, that there weren't weaknesses. There were, but it's the standout items that separated him from the rest of his contemporaries. And one of the reasons for that was the fact that he had so much time to read and absorb literature at a young age. And I've always thought that that contributed to the fluency of his expression, the development of his intellect, and his ability to stand up to argument, whether it was in the Board of Deputies, whether it was within the Communist Party, whether it was inside China. He was a man who was blessed with a powerful intellect that was sharpened by his constant love of books. And that was something that came out of the tragedy of his asthma. His asthma affected his schooling. His asthma prevented him from going into the armed forces. He became an air raid warden, and his asthma affected him throughout his life. It was a familiar thing to come home one day from school and to see him heaving and puffing because he would be inhaling from the intoxicator. It was very, very difficult for him, and it was a big negative in his life that he turned into a positive. So life at home, as I said, his father was not a man of any great intellectual stature. It wasn't as if my father inherited knowledge, abilities, argument from his own father. I remember once talking to my father and his sister, my very lovely Auntie Lily. What was it like being at home with the parents? They said, well, we didn't actually speak a lot. The parents spoke Yiddish. The father was from Poland, the mother was from Russia. Their mutual language was Yiddish, which was a mid-European form of communication by the Jews. And it was something that wasn't passed down to the generation, the children, who were learning English. So the natural flow of conversation that we're used to here in our era, that wasn't so dominant living in Hackney in the 1920s. But the house was conventional, it was kosher. They had a white tablecloth on a Friday night. They observed all the holidays, regularly went to shul on Shabbat, and it was not an unusual feature to see Jack prominently active in the synagogue during this period. He accepted it all. He didn't question it. That was how it was to be. That was his education. He knew where he came from. He hadn't, as yet, developed a very inquiring mind. He was an enthusiastic boy. His friends, Jack Imber, Manny Lustig, they were boys from school. He got into trouble at school. He would get reported to the headmaster. But to all intents and purposes, he was an enthusiastic Jewish boy living off the streets of Hackney. He met my mother when he was 17. The two of them remained sweethearts, married in 1939. And as I said, my mother's family affected my father's politics considerably. So at this stage of the narrative, I think it's good to produce just some photos which give you a feel for the context of the time. And the first photo I want to show is of Jack's parents. That's his mother from Russia on the left, his father from Poland on the right. I don't think it's their wedding photo, but it's certainly a very formal photo. But then all photos of that era were rather formal. The second photo I want to show is of Jack as a baby, a young kid anyhow, with his mother. It just shows mother and child. and again, it's an affectionate photo, which tells you a little bit about Jack's home life. So now I'm coming to the third photo, which is a family photo of my grandparents. On the bottom left of the photo is Jack as a young lad. Above him is his brother. It's the only picture of his brother Joe. He died in 1921. Jack's mother is in the photo together with his two sisters, Golda, who died in 1933, and Lily, who lived a long life and was a very active member of our family down the years. The other picture I just want to put in to give you a flavour of his life in the East End, and remember Jack was a rather football crazy, as were all his contemporaries. They were all fans initially of Clapton Orient, and then when Herbert Chapman came to Arsenal and Arsenal began to become a top team, all the affiliations switched to Highbury. And Arsenal won the Cup in 1930. They won the league, 5 titles in the 1930s as well. And during this period, of course, Jack was an active footballer. He played for the local Maccabi team, and you'll see him in this picture. He's in the middle of the photo, in the number 6 left half position. He enjoyed his football, and it's something he passed on to all his children. Okay, that brings me to the end of the photos covering the early upbringing period. So this traditional Jewish upbringing changed with the arrival of Hitler. I can't impress upon you the significance of the year 1933. It's difficult in 2025 to look back and try to rebuild the building blocks that were in place in that year. It's even harder for you 100 years, 200 years on. But Hitler changed everything. And my father's politics changed very, very quickly. He started to ask questions. And what brought it to his attention was not books, it wasn't ideas, it wasn't discussions. It was trouble on the streets of Hackney. Hitler was in Germany, but Mosley was in London. And Mosley was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. And it was Mosley's bully boys who became the violent perpetrators of violence, mainly on Jews, in the East End of London. And that is what politicized my father. He asked questions of the rabbis. The response of the rabbis was, take a low profile, this will pass. This explanation never made much sense to my father, and he couldn't stand by and allow this to continue without him being involved. And it was acutely personal because in the street where he was living at that time were the headquarters of the local branch of the British Union of Fascists. So they were across the road behind the police station in Hackney, in Mare Street. So it was a very real, direct assault on his senses that led him to begin to think in political terms. And then he began to ask questions about politics generally, about Mosley, about Hitler, about Germany, about Russia and the revolution of 1917, Franco and Guernica in Spain, and also the rise of Stalin in Russia and Franklin Roosevelt in America. He began to ask questions about world affairs. He began to read. Remember, a man who'd grown up with a love of books searched in the library for more books to enable him to come to understand. And he went on a very speedy journey. He became quickly frustrated because the key issue was confronting the fascists. This was the determining political issue of his time. This is the one factor that politicized him. Who was going to provide the answers? Where could he go to find political leadership that would guide him to know how to confront the bully boys on the streets of Church Road where he lived in Hackney, or Mare Street in Hackney, or Graham Road in Hackney? That was his home. It was Dalston as well, it was Stepney, it was Kingsland High Road. The area was very Jewish. The British Union of Fascists were all over the East End. Who was going to fight them? And he didn't get the answers from the Liberal Party. He didn't get the answers from the Labour Party in the grip of appeasement. And just let me say a little something about appeasement, because it's a much criticised policy, but it had its origins in a desire to avoid a repeat of the First World War. The First World War had been so bad, the loss of life had been so enormous. The books written by Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, the tragedy of the First World War was widely known. People were aware how terrible it was. And there was in Britain at that time an understandable wish not to repeat. And many people with pacifist inclinations wanted to play down the option of confronting fascism here in London. But Jack knew his political instincts was the bully boys needed to be beaten, Jews needed to be protected, and he didn't get much guidance from the Jews. The Jewish leadership, as I said, generally said to him, keep a low profile, don't provoke the situation, leave it to the authorities, they'll get rid of the fascists for us. But they didn't. Fascism grew, and Jack's education advanced, and he quickly went through the Labour Party, and he found himself the people who were providing leadership in the East End of London in the latter years of the 1930s was the Communist Party. That's the irony of the political situation in the East End. Now, when we come to talk about the Communist Party, we're up against a wall of prejudice because it very rarely gets a fair hearing, because it's dismissed, because Stalin was a dictator, Mao Zedong is meant to be a dictator, the Chinese are meant to have committed genocide against the Uyghurs. Wherever you come up against communism, you come up against a stern attack on communism and a stern defense of the status quo in Britain. But at that time, the key struggle taking place for Jews living in London was to fight the fascists. And as you know, many of you will remember the Cable Street confrontation of 1936. My mother and father were both there, where they were both fighting. I remember talking to them and listening to their account about the narrative. This key struggle in the 1930s was defeating the fascists. Who was leading the battle against the fascists? It was the Communist Party, not the Labour Party. And it was to the Communist Party that many Jewish people drifted for support, because there was vehemence, there was determination, there was a clear political line that emerged from the leadership of the Communist Party in Britain at that time. Remember, this is still 39. This is before the war started. And Jack's abilities, this is the other point I want to make, it's not simply the background of what was happening in the East End of London at the time, but this gave an opportunity for Jack's accumulated skills and experience to come to the fore. You see, he was not only a man of clear thinking because of books that he'd read and ideas that he'd developed, he was also an impressive speaker. He had, I hate the phrase, the gift of the gab, because it makes it sound like it's something that's taken off a shelf. It wasn't. He loved words, he loved expression, and he studied communication. And when he spoke, people listened. People often speak and they make a lot of noise and no impact. But I've seen many places over the years when my father got up to speak on any subject, people would stop and listen because they knew that he had knowledge, experience, information. He knew what he was talking about. And he came to the attention of the Jewish leadership. He became involved with the Board of Deputies and found himself in conflict with the Jewish leadership. He had no time for the Board of Deputies. He had no time for the hierarchy. There's one story I do like to tell. There was a nasty little shit of an MP called Harold Sorroff. He was Jewish, but he was very right-wing Jewish. unbelievably right-wing. And he was on the Board of Deputies. The Board of Deputies is the Jewish parliament, and it would meet once a month, and the representatives of all the synagogues would be present, and Jack and his group of left-wingers were a pretty powerful small minority within the Board of Deputies. So there's one debate that's taking place. And on the other side of the debate is Harold Soref, who not yet was a Tory MP. He became a Tory MP. At that time, he was just an unpleasant right-wing Jew. And he happened to be celebrating his 30th birthday. So the debate continues, and I think my father had this prearranged, I'm not sure. But in the course of his debate, he made a very wounding comment aimed at Soref, and the chant went up, withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. And I think the room had about 300 odd people in it. The chant was vehement, it was focused, and it was all focused on my father. And my father was only about 5'7", 5'8". He wasn't a big man, had a bit of a tummy on him. And he was the focus of all this vehemence, withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. And bearing in mind it was Soref's 30th birthday, my father slowly rose to his feet and he said, "I've been asked to withdraw. Me." Pause for effect. Then he went on to say, "Wouldn't it have been better if Mr. Soref's father had withdrawn 29 years and 3 months ago?" Collapse of Stout Party. One of the funniest moments in the whole history of the Board of Deputies. Soref was made to look stupid, and my father became known as an oratorical hero. So he became a man of influence, and this led to the questions that I've often been asked about his relationship with the Communist Party, because it was the Communist Party where he found his political home, and he quickly rose through the ranks, and he was quickly recognized as a man of ability. He'd done his homework, he'd read the Communist Manifesto, started reading books by Lenin on state and revolution, he read Stalin on the economic problems of socialism. He didn't pretend to be an authority on the works of Marxism, but he began to grapple with the ideas of Marxism at a time when world politics was dividing. On the one hand, you had Germany, Japan, and Italy with Mussolini. And on the other hand, you had Uncle Joe Stalin was our ally, together with the Americans who came on board after Pearl Harbor. And together the Allies mounted eventually the invasion of Europe with the Normandy landings. So if you look at this particular period of time, first of all, Jack's gone through a change. 1933 was the turning point. Hitler comes to power. Mosley comes to the streets of the East End. His political activity is suddenly accelerated. Secondly, he's looking for a political home. He doesn't know where he's going to rest. The Liberal Party is excluded. The Labour Party is rejected. He finds himself with the party at that time leading the struggle on the streets of the East End, to which many Jews gathered in the late 30s, because they knew if they were looking to take on the violence of Mosley, then it was being led by the Communist Party. There were arguments within the Jewish community, and I've always wanted to write a book tracing the editorials of the Jewish Chronicle during this period, because I think their political line changed considerably from the low-key approach of the early 1930s to a growing awareness after Cable Street that there needed to be a policy of confrontation of the fascists. You then have 1936, the Cable Street confrontation, which politicizes so many people. And then you find at this time, by now, my father has become recognized by leading people within the Communist Party. This is the significance. This is where his journey led him. He had come to the attention of the leadership of the Communist Party. Many of them were Jews, but other names, Harry Pollitt, Johnny Gollan, Reuben Felber, Sam Russell, George Matthews, the editor of the Daily Worker, all of these became people with whom my father was in contact. And the question has always arisen, was my father a communist? And I want to answer that question now. He was never a member of the Communist Party. He never joined the Communist Party. He was never a card-carrying member of the party. But that was by agreement with the party. There was a recognition that Jack's talents took him into the world of what you might loosely call the United Front. He was mixing in a political community which comprised people whose views were anti-Nazi, but they were not necessarily left-wing, socialist, or even communist. And it was in that milieu, through the Trades Advisory Council in particular, which Jack was a leading member of, he was forever on his feet, talking, arguing, discussing the emergence of the period running up to World War II and the need for a strong line against appeasement. He became a powerful spokesman, but he never actually joined the party, but on his own admission. And I remember he told me this story. I had a long session with my father in the Peking Hotel in Moscow when he told me the story of his links with the Communist Party. He was very close to Harry Pollitt, and I remember we had Harry Pollitt over for dinner to our house in Deansway. We knew Johnny Gollan. We knew especially the arch theorist of the Communist Party was a man called Palm Dutt. And all of these people came to our house in Deansway. When I was growing up, I'm jumping now a little bit to when I was 6, 7, and 8, and I've got a bit of a special memory, and people say, how do you possibly remember all this? I'm tested, and my memory is really almost 100%.
Now, this second section of photos covers more politics and China, and I start with a photo which is actually taken in July 1945, and the man being carried aloft on the shoulders of my father is Phil Paratin, who became one of the 2 communist MPs elected to the Houses of Parliament in the post-war election in July 45. Jack's politics are quite apparent by his involvement in the election and by him helping to celebrate with Phil Paratin by carrying him aloft amongst the crowd applauding. Phil Paratin remained an MP until 1950. Now, the other photos that I want to produce of this period focus on the Moscow International Economic Conference. And there's first of all the picture of the front cover, and you'll see that the conference was held in Moscow between the 3rd and 12th of April 1952. There is one picture, a photo of Jack's speech at the conference, which we've managed to reproduce, which he made on the second day when he was seeking to bring matters together. But the other picture that's of interest, and particularly of interest to our friends in China, is the list of Chinese representatives who were at this Moscow conference. And you'll see the name at the top is Nanhan Cheng, then Lei Yunmin, and then the third name, and I've got a picture of him later on, is this gentleman, Dr. Qi Chaoting, who was the prime mover in the creation of a relationship between Jack and China. And Dr. Qi is described there as an economist, a member of the Academy of Sciences, a member of the Board of Directors, and Vice President of the Bank of China. He was a very influential man, and he's one who identified Jack early on as a potential long-term business partner. It was a very wise decision. Dr. Qi died in 1963, and I remember being abroad, opening a copy of the Times and suddenly being confronted by an obituary, which was a long article about the life of Dr. Qi. He was that important. His brother subsequently became an ambassador of China to the UK. But Dr. Qi was the significant counterpart to my father in these early days. Now there's 3 other photos that I want to show you. These focus much more on my father. The first actually isn't my father. The first is a photo taken in China of my mother standing with Dr. Ji Chao-ting. He is the Chinese man in the center of the photo. They were on travels in the 1950s around China, and Dr. Ji always accompanied my parents when they traveled anywhere. And this is a picture that captures a warm moment in the friendship that emerged between the Perry family and the Ji family. I've got now two final photos, which I put near the end of this presentation, because they are quite contrasting, but they both feature Jack. One of the things the company did in the latter years was to sponsor football teams to go to China. We took West Bromwich Albion in 1978, and we took Watford twice, in 1983 and 1986. And this picture I'm showing you of Jack with Elton John was taken on Watford's first visit to China in 1983. Watford played matches in the Workers' Stadium in Beijing and in Shanghai and in Guangzhou. But this casual moment of Jack and Elton John somehow conveys the warmth and the spirit and the conviviality of Jack and also of Elton. Elton always said about that first visit to China, he could walk the streets of Beijing because nobody knew who he was, and he was very relaxed to be able to do something in China that he could never do in the West, where he was too well known. Now, I come now to the last photo, which is just of Jack, and it's Jack in full flow, Jack making a speech. And if you look closely at this photo, I think the power and influence of my father comes across very, very well. First of all, you'll see he's leaning forward and he's making his points with clarity, you can be sure. But it's the use of his hand, the eyes, the gaze, the focus. And when Jack did speak, whether it was about China, whether it was about anti-Semitism, even if it was about Arsenal or politics here in the UK, he had a capacity for eloquence and enthusiasm which always caught the attention of the people. And I think this is a good photo to end on, because looking at that photo, I can sense the spirit, the enthusiasm, and the power of the man who is the focus of this film, The Life and Times of Jack Perry. It's a good note to end on.
But I remember this period because into our house came Harry Pollitt, Palm Dutt, Johnny Gollan, and other leaders of the party. And my father was part of it. I was proud, but I also knew that there was something dramatically sensitive about it, because being a communist, even in those days, and I'm talking after the war, but Jack's politics were before the war, and I wasn't born until the 3rd of May 1945. But in that run-up to the outbreak of hostilities, Jack's political position had become firmly identified within the Communist Party and within King Street. Never a card-carrying member, but a man who accepted the discipline of the party. And he was widely respected. After the war, when we were living in East Finchley, we'd come back from Northampton. I should explain that my family took off to Northampton during the war to avoid the bombing, the Blitz. But when the war was over, they came back to East Finchley. That's where we lived. And my father, by now, had become a successful dress manufacturer, a prominent political person on the left. And suddenly, into view comes a very important conference. And I want to talk about that because this is the next stage. This is the beginning of the entry onto the scene of China. My father's done his apprenticeship. He's grown up as a good Jewish boy in the East End of London. His political development has been accelerated by the circumstances taking place in the 30s, the Jarrow marches, the unemployment, the policy of appeasement, the coming approach of hostilities for the Second World War. He goes through the war as a trade warden, comes out at the end, and he gets involved with a conference in Moscow called the Moscow Economic Conference. And this takes place in April 1952. It's sandwiched in between the semi-final and the final of the FA Cup. Big event in my life. I'm 7 in 1952. My father takes me to the semi-final against Chelsea at Tottenham Hotspur's ground. There's a replay, we win the replay. Yippee, we're in the final. The final takes place on my birthday. As a big thing, my father takes me to the cup final. Whilst this is going on, he's going backwards and forwards to the Soviet Union. Why? Because he's become part of the organizing committee of the Moscow Economic Conference. It was held, as I said, in Moscow in 1952, and it was conceived as a conference designed to break the trade embargo imposed upon the Soviet Union by the US. So we've got to jump back a bit. The war has finished. Hitler has been defeated. Stalin has played an enormously successful role in defeating the Germans. But the political situation in Britain changes because of the Fulton, Missouri speech by Churchill in 1946. He's voted out of office. He's leader of the opposition. He goes to America and he makes a speech which sets the mood for world politics for the next 50 years. From Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, an iron curtain has descended. And the Soviet Union, which was our ally, was now our enemy. And the Communist Party, which had been tolerated because it was supporting the war effort with the Soviets against Hitler, now became the enemy because it was seen as the spokesman for the Soviet Union, which was now our number one enemy. This is the era of McCarthyism, of John Foster Dulles, the 1950s, the execution of the Rosenbergs in America. The political situation post-war was tense, and it aroused the attentions of the MI5 and in particular the focus on my father, because he had become something of a public figure. As I said, never an established member of the party, but regarded by the British authorities as a communist. And I've seen papers handed to me by a person who wrote a book about the historian Trevor Roper. I think his name is Devonport Lewis. I always forget his name for sure. But he wrote a book about the times of Hugh Trevor Roper, which features me and which features me talking about China in 1965 when I was in China. But I'm jumping the gun a bit. The reason I mention that book of 1966 is because it includes references to my father as being a person of interest to the authorities here in the UK. Again, my father was never a member of the party, but he accepted the discipline and he remained active, and people would come to our house who were politically leaders until the dispute between the Soviet Union and China became acute. The British Communist Party was unreservedly on the side of the Soviet Union. My father was increasingly enthusiastic about China. That came along a little later in the 50s. The period I'm talking about now, because this is when he meets the Chinese, is 1952. The Moscow Economic Conference is a very big event, and it's the first public appearance of representatives of China on the international scene. There's a preparatory committee that meets over an 18-month period. My father is catapulted into membership of that committee, and he's also made secretary of the British delegation. He knew how to utilize power and influence. He was a much supported man by a famous professor of economics from Cambridge University called Joan Robinson, who was very prominent during this period. She thought the world of my father, as did her colleague Richard Kahn. The two of them, Joan Robinson and Kahn, had been the closest associates of J. Maynard Keynes when he wrote his famous book on the general theory of interest and money in the 30s. So you're talking about academics of the highest level, and they thought the world of Jack. And when they got involved with this conference, because they wanted fair play for the Soviet Union after the war as well, they wanted trade to take place between East and West, something the Americans were trying to stop. They recommended that Jack be made the secretary of the British delegation, which he was. And he took part in that conference in Moscow, and that is where he met the Chinese. What he didn't know at that time was the Chinese had been watching him. The Chinese were coming out of their civil war. The Chinese state had come into existence on the 1st of October 1949. It was 600 million people. It had won a victory that no one had expected, and it was a challenge to the Americans, who had entered upon a period of confrontation with the Soviet Union, dispensing with the Soviet Union as an ally against Germany. Germany is defeated. Now the enemy is the Soviet Union, and associated with the Soviet Union was China. So my father is involved in this milieu of politics that's taking place in the period of the early 1950s, and his name features. We always used to say we thought the phone was tapped because we heard so many clicks on our phone whenever we were in conversations. And I know there are papers, I haven't yet managed to access them. I've got to be a bit more diligent under the Freedom of Information Act. But there are references to my father in the writings of MI5 during this period. I've seen one, and I know more exists, and it's a matter of getting hold of it. They suspected him of being a member of the party. He wasn't a member of the party, but as I said, he accepted the discipline of the party. So my father is at the Moscow Economic Conference. The Chinese are at the Moscow Economic Conference. And he gets an approach from the Chinese. That's where it started. The Chinese had done their homework. As I said, they knew Professor Robinson, they knew Professor Kahn, and more important than that, they knew Professor Joseph Needham. Joseph Needham became the master of Gonville and Keyes College. He was the big academic scholar on China, the acknowledged world expert. And my father impressed everybody that he met with his grasp of politics and world affairs. And he was quickly catapulted into a position of leadership at this international conference. At that conference, he got a phone call. Mr. Perry, my name is so-and-so. My father knew who it was because he'd sat on the same committee. He'd met him a few times, hadn't really had any lengthy conversations with him. But he said, "Can I meet you?" And my father said yes. And he was intrigued. At that stage, he was still in the dress business. He'd done well in dress business. On his own admission, he knew he was a good businessman, but he was a good businessman in a narrow area. And he was met by two men, came to his room. "We want to talk to you." This was Lu Shucheng and Xi Qiaoting. Lu Shucheng was a very senior member of the Chinese trade business community, and he and Xi Qiaoting reported directly to the then foreign minister, who was Zhou Enlai, and they were briefed. This is China looking ahead. This is 1952. You can imagine the situation. They've just become the government of the People's Republic of China, but they're looking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They're looking ahead to where they're going to be in 50 years, 100 years. And they know they need trade partners that they can rely upon. And the Chinese know that they are not going to go back and have trade relations with anybody that was responsible for the terrible opium trade that corrupted and damaged so many of the Chinese people for so many years. So the field was narrow. Who could the Chinese rely upon to become their arm's length trade partners? And having watched Jack in operation at the Moscow Economic Conference, having checked him out with Professors Needham, Kahn, and Robinson, and having met him at meetings, they met with him and took him by surprise by saying they wanted him to consider forming a company which would be independent in the UK. Its purpose would be to develop trade with the People's Republic of China. Well, Jack had not anticipated this. He was a shrewd man and he usually saw things coming. This one he hadn't seen because he was still dominated by his thoughts about getting the dress trade back on its feet after the Second World War. And the dress trade was an expanding business. Britain was beginning to approach the period of you've never had it so good. People were beginning to think in terms of leisure clothes, and dresses was one of the principal leisure clothes. So Jack was in the right industry at the right time when along comes the Chinese and said, "Oi, make a turn, make a change. We've watched you, we've noticed you, we've seen you, we're impressed with you." This is my summary of what they said to him, but this is what it was. They wanted to convince him. They knew they were going to develop business long-term with the UK, with the US. It was only a matter of years before China would grow and develop and turn itself into a successful society. Difficult to envisage this in 1952 when things were so grim and the civil wars had only just ended in 1949. But they were impressed. They knew they had an agenda, the Chinese. They knew that they were looking ahead 20, 30 years. They were looking for some people in whom they could trust. And Jack was top of the pile. Wonderful mark of respect to him. And he was obviously touched by the reputation that he realized the Chinese had developed about him. And he was really quite taken aback. Initially, I think he was intimidated. I think he was frightened. What do I know about trade? I don't know a letter of credit from a booking foreign currency. I wouldn't know how to ship goods on freight. I don't know anything about currencies. He knew about dresses, and he knew how to make dresses and sell dresses, and he knew to go to C&A and other main stores and do business and sell dresses. This is before C&A became persona non grata for different reasons. I don't need to go into that now. So Jack was now faced with a dilemma. He was coming back to London. The cup final was the next day. It was my 7th birthday, and he knew he had to sit down and have a chat with his wife. And this was all in 1952. This was the key turning point. The upshot of it all is that Jack decided to take the plunge. He was impressed with the attention that the Chinese had shown in him. He was becoming a little disenchanted with the dress business. He did tend to row with his partners. He was very impressed with the encouragement that came from Joan Robinson. And it also merged in, was consistent with the politics that had developed as a result of his confrontations with Mosley in the 1930s, his relationships with the Communist Party during the Second World War. So this remarkable man who left school at 14, I should say about my father, he did manage to get a scholarship to Dame Alice Owen, which was a mark of his achievement and was a big, big success. And he got that at the age of 10. But he had to leave at the age of 12 because he had to go out. It didn't cost him anything to go to Dame Alice Owen. And he was in tears when he was told he'd have to leave Dame Alice Owen because he would have to go out and work and contribute towards the meagre family budget. That's how hard things were. His father was not a very successful tailor, and Jack's 10 bob a week as an assistant warehouseman, which is where he started, was necessary at that time when he left school in the late 1920s. But he had become a successful businessman. He had set up his own business, and he had developed with partners, and he had a thriving business. And all of that was to be put to one side in pursuit of a wholly new endeavor in an area where he had no experience. That was the significance of the approach that came from China. And it's the subject which gives me enormous pride and pleasure. I'm extremely proud of my father. Let me make this quite clear to you. He wasn't always an easy man, and we did have our ups and downs, which I regret, but they happened. My father was a person who was of firm mind, and whilst I take my share of the blame for the arguments that we had down the years, it never, ever displaced my deep love and affection for the man. He was a hero to me because he was such a fighter. He took on people. I was so pleased to have, as a father figure, somebody who never cowed away. He always went towards the sound of gunfire. And here he was. I remember being at home in the early 1950s, and I would see Palm Dutt and Harry Pollitt and Johnny Gollan coming into our house in middle-class suburbia, 55 Deansway, to talk about the political issues arising out of the Moscow conference. I spent a lot of time with my father at this particular stage because my mother had 5 children, and she would often say to Jack, "You take the boy, I'll look after the 2 young ones." And I was often with my father, sitting quietly alongside him whilst he had meetings, sometimes at the Russian trade delegation, sometimes with the Chinese trade delegation. And this is 52, 53, 54, 55, a very giddy period for me. I remember one evening my father said, "Come on, I've got to go and collect Uncle Harry. He's coming over for dinner." I said, "Well, who's Uncle Harry?" I knew Harry Lubbock, I knew Harry Ibbotson, I knew Harry Pell, I knew a number of Harrys. It was a very popular Jewish name. This one man wasn't a Jew. This was Harry Pollitt. He lived in Colindale, not far from Finchley, where we lived, and Jack was driving over to pick him up, and he was introduced to me as Uncle Harry. And I remember sitting there at the house in Deansway. My mother, who was a good cook, made a lovely meal for Jack and Doris and Harry Pollitt, and even I was allowed to sit and eat. These were very, very unusual times, difficult to explain, but important for people to have a grasp, because down the centuries this story is going to become more and more important. What we're dealing with is the first Western businessman to go to China, and I'm so proud to say it was my father. And my father got that through his own efforts, through his own abilities. And I'll just tell you briefly about that first visit. It happened as a result of the Moscow Economic Conference, the meeting he had with these 2 Chinese. He said, "Mr. Perry, we'd like you to arrange to bring a delegation of British businessmen to China. Never been done before." And Jack got together a group of people. He eventually formed 15 companies, into a group of 15 companies. They called themselves the 48 Group because they represented a total of 48 companies. And they met in Hong Kong prior to making arrangements to go up to Beijing in 1953, when my father got a phone call saying, "Jack Perry, we want you to come ahead of your delegation," which he did. The reason he went to Beijing on his own and became the first Western businessman to go to China was because the Chinese wanted to prepare for the visit of the visiting British delegation, wanted to know more about their business activities so that they could arrange to set up contracts to give the whole initiative some concrete achievement with the actual execution of business contracts. So my father went ahead of this delegation in 1953 and stayed in Beijing for a few days before he was joined by the rest of the delegation. And that made him the first Western businessman to go to China, which is a very big achievement to me now when I think about it. You see all the people flooding off to China, all the newspaper reports. At the time he went, there was no one else there. There wasn't even, I think there was a British chargé d'affaires. They had relationships in 1949, but the relationship between Britain and China was very cold because of the continuing activities of the Korean War. British soldiers were being killed, Chinese soldiers were being killed. That was a sensitive and controversial topic. But the British knew ahead of time that that peace would come and that China needed to be a country with whom there needed to be relations developed. The focus of my presentation today is to give you, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, an awareness of your own family background. It so happens that Jack Perry is a name that's going to stand out for many years because of his achievements, and it's something you're going to read about. I'm often asked, what do you think your father would think of China today? Which is conjecture, because I'm being asked to suggest what my father would think about developments over the last 30 years. He died in 1996, and China's progress, especially under Xi Jinping since 2012, has been enormous and significant. And all that Jack predicted as a result of his studies in the 50s and his visits to China in the 60s, the 70s. I remember he went every year, he sent us letters. We grew up with China's coursing through our veins. We were hearing more about China than almost anything else. And I think Jack would have a combination of pride and concern. He would be extremely pleased that China had become the significant nation that it is now come in world affairs. People talk about the coming struggle between China and America, and they're right. Let me just say very briefly, the history of mankind is the ebb and flow of great powers. They rise and they fall. And if you go back through history, you deal with Attila the Hun, Charlemagne, you deal with Henry VIII, you deal with Philip II, you come up to the First World War, you'll find a constant observation of history is that empires come and empires go. China is determined not to become an empire, but China will become the most powerful economy in the world because of its success in creating long-term stability and progress in China. I don't say that's all plain sailing, and I don't say that China's without challenges looking ahead, and they do face challenges looking ahead, but they have made an enormous achievement. And I'll just give you two facts to cite my confidence. One is that they have removed 1 billion people from poverty, and that's just not a description of an event. It's something that involves the movement and changes of the most enormous number of people inside China to make that possible, to build the houses and the hospitals and the roads and the schools and the towns, and to eliminate the scourge of bad health and instability in society. China, after the Cultural Revolution especially, has become a society focused on developing its economy and bringing a higher standard of living to its people, not by imposing itself on any other country, but by continuing to develop its economy and its political system under the leadership of the Communist Party. It's controversial, Is it a dictatorship? Is it democracy? Are the people free? Well, I would just give you one often cited fact that's much overlooked in the West. But in the last year before COVID, the number of Chinese tourists that traveled outside China was 137 million people. Almost twice the size of the population of the UK. And they traveled. The significant thing is they all came home. You listen to some people talking about China, you'd think that it was a big prison. The people were frightened, intimidated, echoing the hardship of life in the Soviet Union in the 30s. They're trying to recreate the same impression about China. But China, it has its problems. China has crime. China has prostitution. China has drugs. It's a society which is dealing with a lot of those problems and trying very hard to eliminate them. But it is also a society which is moving forward with growing confidence, albeit they've hit some economic headwinds with the disasters that have affected their property sector of their economy. But China is on a path, and it will continue in that direction. Where my father may have reservations about what's happening in China is the emergence of the 800 plus billionaires in China and the growing number of wage differential levels for the people who are working within China. How to reconcile that with the construction of a classless society. And it may be the future in terms of creating a communist society is something which would look a little murky, a little unclear now. But what you can say about China is that it goes forward, it is stronger, it has lent over trillions of dollars to the third world without having one Chinese soldier tracking one Chinese RMB investment anywhere in the world. China's made the most enormous impact upon the circumstances of what used to be called the third world, and we now have the emergence of the global south. But I think my father would have questions about aspects of Chinese society today and wonder whether that was offensive to some of the basic principles that underlay the idea of the ethical society that it's committed to building. I'm not going to make any long-term judgments about that. It's just something which has not got to be considered because China's progress has been so considerable, so rapid, it's taken the world by storm. Put all that to one side, and I know this is 2025, I'm looking back to 1952, earlier back to the 1930s, and the emergence of a man who had a vision. He had a vision of change that emerged from a struggle against the fascists on the streets of the East End of London, introduced him to a concept of society that he embraced, took him to a country, modest, small, developing China, but a society that he could see was going to shake the world. And I think it was Napoleon who said, "Let China sleep, because when it wakes, it will shake the world." China's woken up, and my father played an important part in allowing China to open its eyes to what the future held for it. So it's an interesting story. I'm sorry if I've gone overboard sometimes, or maybe got it out of balance when you're speaking extemporaneously, as I am, directly to you, and I don't know who you are who's going to be listening. I just want you to try and buy in to this sense of time and dynamism, and to remember that there was a moment in time when a little Jewish boy from Hackney had a role to play in the opening up of China and the development of the world as we see it today. Okay, we come towards the end of this presentation. I've made some final notes, and the first word on my notes is Harvard, and it reminds me of a very funny story involving my father. And let me give you the context. It's the announcement of Nixon's visit to China. The announcement is made in November 1971. The visit takes place in February 1972. On the day that the visit is announced, my father gets a phone call from an American friend, a banker from Wall Street called Robert Ruser, who my father had got to know well. He actually went to China with Ruser in the company of Theodore Sorensen, the man who composed that famous statement of Kennedy's at his inauguration: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Anyhow, that's sidetracking. I'm talking about Harvard because my father's first visit to America, he had not been there for 10 years. He had been barred from America because he was trading with China. America had no Americans who were allowed to visit China, so the country had a dearth of information about China. And Ruser said, Jack, come, you're needed. Jack said, you know, I can't get a visa. Ruser said, go to the embassy tomorrow. I'm sure you'll get a visa. He did. He got his visa, and he makes his first visit to America, and he's enjoying it because at every dinner table there's people from the FBI and the CIA, and my father's jesting with them about their continued attempts to keep him out of China. Anyhow, he suddenly gets an invitation to go to Harvard University, and he's very pleased to be invited. And he goes, makes the journey. I should remind people that Harvard had a reputation for anti-Semitism, and this has been built and developed by Alan Dershowitz, who had a number of confrontations with the hierarchy at Harvard. So my father arrives at Harvard. He's shown into an ante-room, and there is the dean of the graduates who's in charge of the meeting, together with the two speakers. My father is the third. The dean says to the first speaker, now you're, I think the name was Symington, you're the senator who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you've discovered China through your participation in the work of that committee. Is that right? Yes. Then he switches to the second speaker. He says, and you're Ambassador Reischauer, and you've been at our Tokyo embassy, and you've been listening into all the traffic that's come in and out of China, and in that way, you've built up a knowledge of China. Is that right? It is. And then he turns to my father and he says, Mr. Perry, all of this has been arranged at quite short notice, and I'm really not prepared. In fact, I haven't been given some introductory comments. How would you like me to introduce you? And my father, quick as a flash, said, just tell the audience I'm a Jew from Lithuania. And the dean said, I'm sorry. And my father said, you got it right. Just tell them I'm a Jew from Lithuania. I'll explain the rest. And my father did. When he spoke, he explained how being a Jew from Lithuania had led him to a situation where he was able to play this role in becoming the first Western businessman to go to China. He chuckled always when he told the story because he enjoyed the embarrassment of the dean. But he did give him the opportunity to introduce his own story to the graduates from Harvard University. Now, the next comment I want to make as a closing comment may surprise quite a few people, but let me explain. The word that dominates my life is fortunate. I believe I've been a very fortunate person in many ways. The parents I had, the life that I led, the schools I went to, the holidays we took. I was fortunate. So many other people had much, much less fortunate lives. And I want to thank one person in particular, which is going to be controversial and surprising. But a man who I didn't like before the war, and a man who I didn't like after the war. But in May 1940, it was the decision of Winston Churchill, to stand firm against Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax, and even the King. What did he stand firm on? He refused to negotiate with Mussolini and Hitler. There were pressures to open up a channel of communication. Churchill resisted. He came under enormous pressure, and had he succumbed, who's to say what would have happened to the Jews of the UK? We know what happened to the Jews of France. They were all corralled into Dranchy, and after a period of time in Dranchy outside Paris, they were sent to all the different camps. And I'm pretty sure that would have been the lot of the British Jews had Churchill negotiated a peace deal with Hitler. In one way or another, British independence would have gone, the Germans would have come, and the plight, the life of Jews in England would have been very different. So in this one respect, important respect, I acknowledge the significant role played by a man who's much derided for his politics before the war, 1926 general strike, the South Wales miners, and after the war, Indian independence, and also being something of a right-wing conservative prime minister. But with that one decision, he propels himself into the position of being a man much respected for the bravery he had in making that decision. He was saying, no, we're going to go to war. We are not going to surrender. A very big decision by a very big man, Winston Churchill. I want to say a few words about the family because I was fortunate enough to be one of 5 children, Gillian, Vivian, Stephen, Jonathan. Sadly, Gillian and Jonathan are no longer with us. Vivian and Stephen are in good health. And we were the beneficiaries of a very fortunate life. We lived in East Finchley. We had holidays every summer. We went to nice restaurants occasionally. We always had a family outing on Boxing Day. We had central heating, meals on the table. We were very, very fortunate. When I think of the plight and the difficulties that affected so many other people after the war, I recognise, due to my father's achievements, hard work, and imagination, he was able to create a lifestyle which enabled me to look back upon my life and say that I was fortunate to be his son, fortunate to be Jewish at a time when Churchill made that big decision, and fortunate to have benefited from the life that my father and my mother led. I should also, and I want to mention my mother. We all think well of our parents, but my mother was an exceptionally pleasant, attractive, warm-hearted person. Nobody had a bad word to say to her. She came from a very good family. She was a very modest person, but she gave me and my brothers and sisters confidence, gave us a concept of life, gave us values, gave us principles, and lived her life with great modesty. She was much loved by all of the friends and people that she encountered. And again, I regard myself as fortunate to have had my mother as my mother and my father as my father. Now, people often deride my father's achievements with 2 phrases that are in common parlance, common usage. The first is that he had the gift of the gab, that really he was nothing more than a Petticoat Lane street trader selling porcelain at half price. He had a way with words and he could persuade people to follow his enthusiasm. Excuse me if I use one foul word, but it's a load of bollocks. He was a man who developed his own ability to speak. He loved words because of the time he'd spent reading books when he was suffering from asthma as a kid. He enjoyed English literature. He enjoyed the English language. He certainly didn't have the gift of the gab. He was a well-spoken man, and he'd worked hard to make himself well-spoken. And then the other comment that I want to knock on the head is the one that says, well, Jack Perry, yes, but he was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. And again, that one word bollocks comes to mind to my Chinese friends who are viewing this film. They may have to have someone help them with that term, but it's an abusive term, and it's me being critical of people who tended to dismiss my father's achievements because they didn't want to give him credit for what he had done. He was in the right place because of his efforts. It was the right time because of his achievements. He was recognized by people in China who had done their homework on who to select to invite to come to China for the first business visit. And their attention focused and settled on Jack Perry. It was him and his achievements and his work. He had impressed Professor Robinson at Cambridge, Professor Kahn at Cambridge, Professor Needham at Cambridge. He was a man who you listened to when you were in his presence and whose thoughts and ideas you gave consideration to after the meeting had finished. I want to tell you one other short story. He went to China for the first time in 1953. And on his return, he got called in by the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. And Eden tore a strip off him. We told you not to go. We do not want to have relations with China. We have state relations as we have to, but that's as far as it goes. China's been involved on the other side in the Korean War, and we don't want to develop relations with China. And Eden went on, even banged the table with his fist. And my father sat there and listened. And then Eden finished his rant, and he said, "Now, Mr. Perry, tell me, what's it like in China? What's going on? Who did you speak? What is the country like? What do you think is the future for China?" Eden wanted to know from a man whose opinions he could trust what was going on in China. He was getting all the information from the embassy, but he wanted a different perspective. And it's interesting that Eden listened when Jack talked about the experience of his 1953 visit. Let me say two other things in these closing comments. First of all, China itself. We're talking about this story partly because of Jack's achievements, coming out of the East End, being a man of enthusiasm, commitment, hard work and ability. But China was the senior partner in this relationship. 600 million people with a future in mind. They were looking around, they cast their eye across the different options. They knew they were poor, they knew they were destitute, they knew they had a long building undertaking to make. They knew it was going to take time, but the Chinese knew in 1953 where they would be in 1963, in 1973, in 2023. They had a long-term view, they had confidence, they knew it would be hard and difficult. They didn't anticipate all the excesses that took place, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in particular. But that was part and parcel of the style and manner of Chinese society. But my father was always very respectful of the achievements of the Chinese in taking a country that was called in 1949 the sick man of Asia and converting it into a country which is shortly to become the largest economy in the world. So I don't want to focus just on my father, although that's the personal story I have to tell because he was the first man. But I want to pay credit as well, as he would do if he was sitting here talking to you, to appreciate the Chinese, thank them for their support, and recognize that China's role in the world has always been much misunderstood by the West to their own error, fault, and consequence. But Jack knew, he was honored, touched, and very, very pleased to be invited to form a company and become an arm's length trading partner of China. And that should never be lost sight of. Talk about my father, talk about his Jewishness, talk about Churchill. But the big picture here is the 600 million people in 1953 that's now become 1.4 billion. Let me now make a final personal comment, if you like. I've spoken about China. I've spoken about my father. My father was a very special man. Yes, he could be a bit difficult at times, and yes, there were ups and downs, but I had tremendous affection. I loved him deeply, and I was very, very upset by his death in 1996. But I'm very aware of his contribution as a father and as a man that played a big role in opening up to China. But there's one other person I feel I should mention who hasn't played such a big role in the China thing, but has for me personally, and I can't end this review of part of my life without paying credit and acknowledging my dear wife who passed away in October 2021, tragically in Tenerife while we were on holiday. Josie was a very lively person. I'm not sure I'm lively. That comment about how we met, that she was asked if she would be interested to meet somebody from London who was a very nice fellow, but a little on the dull side. I don't know whether it's true or not, but compared with my wife, I was dull. She was the one that turned the house into a place of liveliness and excitement, with the children, with the friends, with the television, with the noise, with the food, the smell of cooking. She made this house a place to live in. And here today I'm speaking to you from the same house, but it's not the same place. Her personality doesn't invade the rooms and the walls of this house. It's a different place. I miss her greatly, and my life has been very different since she passed away. And I just want to pay respect to my wife because she's a big part of my life. We were married for 39 years. It's a long time. We do have 4 children and nine grandchildren. Whoops, the last one arrived just 2 weeks ago. Sorry, Joanna. So 9 grandchildren. And I think that's probably a good note on which to end this story, because this is really a story about a little segment of history, about a unique moment in the evolution of the historical era in which we live, the first opening to China, and my father played a significant role in it. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you found it as enjoyable listening as I have enjoyed talking. Thank you very much.